The old man's trembling hands clutched the small paper bag as he shuffled through the bank's polished marble floor. His gray hair was unkempt, his clothes worn thin, yet his eyes carried a quiet dignity that no poverty could erase. But to the watchful crowd, all they saw was a frail black man who looked out of place. When a missing wallet was suddenly reported, whispers turned into accusations, and fingers pointed directly at him. The security guard's harsh grip closed around his arm, dragging him forward while onlookers shook their heads, some sneering, others simply watching. No one asked for proof. No one cared about the truth. In their eyes, his skin color was enough evidence. The humiliation burned deeper than the guard's rough hold. Years of scars from a world that never gave him a chance resurfaced in an instant. His voice, fragile, yet pleading, was drowned out by prejudice that filled the room like poison. Then, just as the shame threatened to crush him entirely, the doors swung open. A man in an immaculate suit strode in, commanding attention with every step. His presence shifted the air, silencing the cruel laughter. Eyes widened. Some recognized him instantly, the billionaire whose name graced headlines and whose wealth held power beyond measure. And in that frozen moment, the crowd gasped as he looked at the elderly man, not with suspicion, but with something far more shocking: recognition. Because this simple thief was his father. Long before the polished floors of the bank and the humiliating grip of suspicion, the old man had lived a life carved out of struggle, silence, and endurance. He had been born in a part of town where the houses leaned tiredly against one another, their wood rotting in places, their paint peeling as though time itself had conspired to erase their dignity. His childhood was not marked by abundance, but by survival. Days of endless work in cotton fields, nights of going to bed with hunger gnawing at his stomach, and mornings of rising before the sun to fetch water for his mother, who was already bent from labor. His father had been a man broken by a world that saw him as less than human. He never looked his children in the eyes for long, as though ashamed to pass on the invisible chains that bound him. The boy grew up watching men like his father endure insults, threats, and beatings without complaint, because complaint led to worse punishment. From a young age, he understood a cruel truth. It was not enough to be honest, hardworking, or kind. The color of his skin would always overshadow the worth of his soul. He learned silence. Silence when a shopkeeper accused him of stealing candy he had not touched. Silence when white children jeered at him in the street, calling him names that sank into his bones. Silence when his teacher told him he was better off working with his hands than dreaming of books. But deep within that silence, something else grew. A quiet strength. A determination to endure, to survive, to prove that even in a world rigged against him, he would not be erased. As the years passed, he became a man of simple means. He took work wherever it could be found, fixing fences, hauling bricks, mending shoes. He never complained about the pay, though it was barely enough to buy bread. He carried himself with a dignity that no poverty could diminish, even as people dismissed him as just another poor black man struggling at the edges of society. He married young, a woman with a laugh so soft it could cut through the darkest days. She saw in him not a man beaten down by the world, but one who carried a fire hidden deep inside. Together they built a small family, one child at first, and later another, a son who would one day rise far beyond the life they knew. That son, though still a child, carried with him a spark that was different. He asked questions, always curious about the world beyond their neighborhood. He looked at books with wonder, tracing his fingers over the letters as though they were keys to a door that only he could see. His father, though barely literate himself, encouraged the boy's hunger for knowledge. In his quiet way, he believed that education was the only weapon sharp enough to cut through the chains of prejudice. But even as he nurtured his son's curiosity, the old man knew the dangers. The world did not forgive ambition in men like them. To reach too high was to invite the weight of a society eager to push them back down. Still, he could not bring himself to dim the light in his son's eyes. He worked longer hours, endured harsher conditions, saved every coin he could spare, not for himself, but for the boy who carried all his unspoken dreams. Tragedy struck early when his wife's laughter faded into silence, claimed by illness they could not afford to treat. The old man, still young then but already weathered by hardship, carried the burden alone. He wore grief like a second skin, but he never let it smother the hope he held for his son. If anything, it made him more determined. Her memory became a promise that their boy would not live and die in the shadows of prejudice, but would rise into a life she had only dreamed of. Every humiliation he endured afterward, every time he was spat on, ignored, underpaid, or accused, he bore with clenched fists hidden in his pockets, because he told himself that if he endured it all, if he bent under the weight of injustice but did not break, his son would have the chance to stand tall. And so, in the quiet rhythm of labor and sacrifice, the foundation of two lives began. The father who carried scars he never showed, and the son whose future he guarded like a flame in the wind. The boy grew in a neighborhood where opportunity was a ghost, talked about, envied, but never seen. Most children around him carried the same destiny as their fathers: labor that bent their backs, wages that barely kept hunger at bay, and dreams that died before they could form. Yet this boy was different, shaped by both his mother's vanished laughter and his father's silent determination. Books became his refuge. They were borrowed, begged for, sometimes even found discarded in bins where others saw only trash. To him, each page was a doorway. He would sit for hours under the dim glow of a streetlight when their small home had no electricity, his thin fingers tracing words he was still learning to understand. His father often watched from the doorway, his own rough hands resting on his knees, silently praying that this hunger for knowledge would never fade. School was both a blessing and a battlefield. His intelligence shone early. Teachers could not ignore his quick grasp of numbers, his ability to weave stories from scraps of lessons, his relentless curiosity. But brilliance could not shield him from cruelty. Some teachers dismissed him, unwilling to believe a black boy could outpace his peers. Classmates taunted him, mocking the patched clothes he wore, whispering insults his father had endured before him. Yet he did not crumble. Instead, every insult became fuel, every dismissal a challenge. Where others sought to drag him down, he found reasons to climb higher. His father's sacrifices were never far from his mind. He saw the calluses that cracked his father's hands, the weariness etched into his face at the end of long days, and he carried those silent testimonies like sacred texts. He told himself he would make it all worth something. Scholarships arrived like cracks of light in a dark room. Small at first, then larger as his brilliance became undeniable. He won contests, outshined expectations, and slowly doors that had always been locked to boys like him began to open. Teachers who once doubted now looked at him with a mix of surprise and pride, though he knew that behind some smiles still lingered disbelief. The father watched it all with a mixture of awe and fear. awe at the sight of his son becoming everything. He had never dared to dream for himself. Fear at the thought that society might try to break him for daring to reach too high. In quiet moments, when his son's head was bent over a book, the father would sit nearby, pretending to mend a shoe or polish a tool, but in truth he was memorizing the image. The boy lit by a fragile lamp, determined, unstoppable. The boy grew into a young man who left their narrow streets for the wide halls of universities that had rarely welcomed faces like his. The father accompanied him on the first day, standing awkwardly among crowds of parents who wore tailored suits and gold watches. He wore his best shirt, ironed as smooth as his rough hands could manage, and shoes that still bore scuffs no polish could hide. He felt invisible in that sea of wealth. But his son never looked at him with shame. When others whispered, the son stood taller, introducing his father proudly, as though daring the world to see the greatness behind the simplicity. University life was not kind. The young man endured isolation, whispers of tokenism, and outright prejudice. Professors sometimes questioned his place in the room, as though waiting for him to falter and prove them right. But he never faltered. He buried himself in study, often working nights at libraries, surviving on little sleep and even less money. He built networks, found mentors willing to see past his skin, and crafted a future brick by brick, paper by paper, exam by exam. Back home, the father worked harder than ever. He sent what little money he could, even when his son assured him it wasn't necessary. For the father, sacrifice was a language of love. If he could not understand the academic texts his son devoured, he could at least ensure that hunger never distracted him, that bills did not chase him out of his studies. The young man graduated with honors that turned heads. Newspapers printed his name. Local communities hailed him as proof that brilliance could not be confined by prejudice. But for the father, the most powerful moment came not from headlines or ceremonies, but from the quiet way his son embraced him afterward, whispering words of gratitude that carried the weight of years. The journey did not end there. Ambition carried the young man further, into graduate schools, into boardrooms, into the intricate dance of finance and investment. He studied markets the way he once devoured books under streetlights, finding patterns where others saw only chaos. He built networks with powerful men who first underestimated him, then scrambled to align with him. Slowly, the boy from the forgotten streets became a man who could move money and markets with a single decision. Wealth followed him like a shadow, but he never forgot the man who had lit his path. The father, though still living simply, was always part of his success. He often visited, carrying with him home-cooked meals wrapped in old cloth, sitting in offices lined with glass and steel, as though they were no different from their own modest home. And yet, beneath the pride and achievement, the scars of racism lingered. The young man had climbed beyond the reach of poverty, but not beyond the reach of prejudice. In whispers, in subtle exclusions, in glances that dismissed his presence, he was reminded that wealth could not erase the color of his skin. The father, too, remained marked by society's cruelty. Though his son's name carried power, he was still judged by his worn clothes, his weathered face, his quiet manner. People saw him not as the father of a billionaire, but as a poor black man who could be accused, dismissed, and humiliated without hesitation. Their lives stood in stark contrast. One, a symbol of success, the other a portrait of humility. Yet they were bound together by love, sacrifice, and an unspoken understanding that every triumph of the son had been built upon the endurance of the father. Wealth came to the son not as a sudden windfall, but as the natural consequence of relentless effort, bold decisions, and a vision others were too timid to pursue. He had a mind trained to see beyond obstacles. Where others saw risks, he saw opportunity. His first ventures were modest, small investments in companies that most ignored, business strategies whispered about in circles that doubted him. Yet one by one, those risks turned into triumphs. The young man became a figure whispered about in financial districts, a name that carried both respect and curiosity. Journalists began to seek him out, intrigued by the story of a man who had climbed from poverty into the rarefied air of billionaires. His face appeared in magazines, his voice quoted in newspapers, his success dissected on television panels. But behind the polished image, he remained grounded by the memory of where he had come from. His father's face, lined with years of hardship, marked by quiet endurance, was never far from his mind. He often credited his father in interviews, describing him as the foundation of his discipline and resilience. Yet the world, always hungry for spectacle, often brushed aside these acknowledgments, preferring to shape the narrative as one of lone genius rather than one of generational sacrifice. The contrast between father and son deepened as their worlds grew further apart. The son lived in glass towers that overlooked sprawling cities, attended galas where chandeliers sparkled like captured stars, and walked red carpets where cameras flashed endlessly. His suits were tailored, his wrist adorned with watches worth more than his father's entire home. He dined with presidents, debated with CEOs, and advised on policies that shaped nations. Meanwhile, the father continued his quiet existence. He lived in the same neighborhood, in the same modest house patched up over the years with his own hands. His clothes remained simple, his shoes worn from decades of labor. Though his son offered him luxury, a mansion, cars, endless comforts, the old man refused. He did not crave wealth. He craved peace, the steady rhythm of life unshaken by extravagance. He tended to a small garden, fed stray cats, and greeted neighbors with the same humility that had carried him through his hardest days. When father and son were seen together, the contrast was striking. The billionaire with his commanding presence, and the old man with his weathered clothes and quiet dignity. Many strangers assumed the old man was a driver, a servant, a forgotten figure trailing in the shadow of greatness. Few guessed he was the man who had made the greatness possible, yet no amount of wealth could shield them from the persistence of prejudice. The son, for all his influence, noticed the subtle shifts in tone when he entered certain rooms. He saw how deals became harder to close until his achievements could no longer be denied, how partnerships required proof beyond proof before trust was extended. He knew that for every headline praising him, there were whispers questioning whether he truly belonged at the table. The father endured his own share of indignities. Shopkeepers still watched him suspiciously when he entered stores. Strangers still dismissed him as a man who had nothing of value to offer. Even as his son's empire grew, the father remained vulnerable to the casual cruelty of a society that judged him by appearance before truth. Despite these realities, their bond did not falter. The son often visited, sitting in the small living room of his father's home, where mismatched chairs and fading curtains spoke of decades untouched by wealth. He would sit at the old wooden table, eating meals cooked with love, listening to his father's slow, thoughtful words. In those moments, he shed the weight of power and returned to the boy who once studied under a dim streetlight, guided by his father's sacrifices. The old man, for his part, never boasted of his son's wealth. Neighbors sometimes teased him, asking why he did not live in a mansion, why he still carried groceries himself, why he walked instead of being driven in sleek cars. He would smile, shake his head, and say only that his son's success was enough for him. What mattered was not the size of his home, but the strength of the values he had passed on. Yet beneath the surface of love and pride, the setup for tragedy was quietly forming. Because society, blinded by prejudice, could not see what bound them. To the world, the old man was still invisible. Just another poor black elder wandering through spaces where people thought he did not belong. And to the world, wealth could not erase suspicion when a skin color carried centuries of unwelcome narratives. It was this blindness, this refusal to see beyond stereotypes, that would soon transform an ordinary visit to the bank into a stage for humiliation and ultimately revelation. The father, in his simplicity, did not anticipate danger when he walked into that building. He carried nothing more than a small paper bag, the same kind he had used for decades, filled with little necessities. To him, the bank was just another errand, another stop in his quiet life. He did not know that within minutes, strangers would look upon him not as a man, not as a father, but as a suspect. And he did not yet know that in the very same building, fate was preparing to pull back the curtain on his life's sacrifices, revealing a truth the world was not ready to see. The seasons had turned many times since the son had become a man of immense power, yet for the father, life carried on in its familiar rhythm. He woke at dawn, shuffled across the creaking floorboards of his small home, and brewed coffee in the same chipped mug he had owned for decades. He watered his garden, spoke softly to the plants as if they could hear his gratitude, and greeted neighbors with the same nod of quiet kindness. Though his son's empire stretched across continents, the father never sought to step into that world fully. He was proud but unassuming, preferring his own neighborhood, where faces were familiar even if life was hard. His clothes remained modest, and his shoes carried the wear of years. To those who did not know him, he appeared to be just another old man drifting through the last chapter of life unnoticed. Yet beneath his calm exterior, time was leaving its mark. His bones ached with every step, his eyesight blurred when he read, and his hands, once steady from years of work, now trembled when he held small objects. Age was not cruel but unrelenting, and the father bore it as he had borne every hardship, silently, without complaint. The son noticed. Though his life was consumed by business, travel, and endless meetings, his heart remained tethered to the man who had raised him. He called often. His voice softened when speaking to his father, and whenever possible, he returned home to sit at that same wooden table. The weight of his empire vanished in those moments, replaced by the comfort of being a son in the presence of the man who had once carried him through the storms of poverty. The contrast between their worlds was not lost on either of them. The son lived in skyscrapers of glass, while the father walked cracked sidewalks patched with weeds. The son rode in sleek cars that drew envious glances, while the father carried his groceries home in worn bags. Yet there was no resentment between them. The son admired his father's humility, and the father respected his son's ambition. They understood that both lives were built on the same foundation of sacrifice and resilience. But society did not see what bound them. In the eyes of strangers, the son's wealth commanded respect, while the father's weathered clothes invited suspicion. People often failed to connect the two, assuming the old man was nobody of significance. To them, he was simply another shadow in a world that rarely looked twice at men like him. The father had long accepted such treatment. He had grown used to clerks watching him too closely, to neighbors who offered pity instead of respect, to strangers who assumed incompetence from the way his hands shook. He carried these indignities as he always had, with quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness consume him. The son, however, saw them differently. Each time he witnessed the world belittle his father, a sharp ache cut through him. He had built wealth, power, and influence, yet none of it seemed to shield the man who had given him everything. No amount of status could erase the scars left by a society that refused to look deeper than the surface. One afternoon, while visiting, the son accompanied his father to a local store. He watched as the clerk addressed him warmly, all smiles and attentiveness, but when the father stepped forward with his purchase, the smile faded. The clerk's tone shifted to impatience, his eyes narrowing as though the old man's presence were an inconvenience. The son's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that confrontation rarely changed minds hardened by prejudice. Yet the image lingered, searing itself into his thoughts. His father, dignified but diminished, dismissed by a world that could not recognize his worth. It was a reminder that the old man lived in constant vulnerability. No amount of money in his son's accounts, no number of headlines praising their family name could erase the way the world judged him at first glance. He remained an easy target for suspicion, a man stripped of protection the moment he stepped outside the shadow of his son's name. Still, the father moved through life with grace. He attended community gatherings, spoke kindly to children, offered advice to neighbors, and gave from the little he had. He never flaunted his son's wealth, never used it as a shield, for he believed dignity was not bought with riches but carried in the heart. And so, on a day that seemed like any other, he set out on errands with the same unhurried pace, his paper bag tucked under his arm. The sun was bright, the streets busy, and the old man, despite his frailty, walked with the same quiet dignity that had defined his life. He did not know that the bank he was about to enter would soon become a stage for the cruelest kind of prejudice, a place where decades of sacrifice would be dismissed in seconds, where whispers would become accusations, and where humiliation would descend like a shadow. Nor did he know that fate had aligned his steps with his son's that day. For while the father moved quietly through the bank's glass doors, the son was not far away, conducting business that carried the weight of empires. Their worlds, so often kept apart, were about to collide in the most unexpected way. The father, in his worn clothes, would be seen as nothing more than a suspect. The son, in his tailored suit, would soon reveal a truth that would leave the crowd speechless. And in that moment, before shame, before revelation, the stage was set. The bank's glass doors slid open with a muted hiss, and the old man stepped inside. His shoes made little sound against the polished floor, though every step seemed to echo in the vast hall. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, bouncing off marble counters and gleaming brass fixtures. To most it was a place of business, a temple of wealth and order. To him, it was simply another errand, one more task in the quiet routine of his life. He carried a small paper bag under his arm. Inside was nothing of significance, some personal documents, a folded newspaper, and a few coins rattling faintly when he shifted his grip. Yet as he crossed the threshold, he felt eyes settle on him. He was used to it by now. The glances of suspicion, the lingering stares that measured him not by his dignity but by his skin, his clothes, the tremor in his hands. He approached the counter with care, placing his bag gently on the polished surface as though afraid to leave a mark. The teller, A young woman with a neat uniform and painted smile looked at him briefly before her expression faltered. Her smile slipped, replaced by a guarded politeness. She asked what he needed, her tone brisk, as though his presence pressed against her patience. Before he could answer, a commotion stirred nearby. A well-dressed customer patted his pockets frantically, turning in circles as he declared his wallet missing. The man's voice rose, carrying across the room like an alarm bell. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the line, and suspicion hung heavy in the air. The father had not moved, his frail hand still resting on the counter, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Eyes darted, searching for someone to blame, someone who looked out of place. And there he was, an elderly black man with worn clothes and a paper bag, standing alone. The accusations came unspoken at first, in narrowed eyes and tilted heads. Then a voice cut through. "Check him." Another echoed, sharper. "It must be him. Look at him." The teller's gaze hardened, and the father felt the weight of prejudice settle upon him like a shroud. He tried to explain, his voice soft, trembling with the effort of being heard, but no one listened. The missing wallet had already written a script, and he had been cast in the role of the thief. A security guard approached, broad-shouldered and stern, his hand already reaching for the old man's arm. The grip was firm, unyielding, dragging him back from the counter as gasps and murmurs spread. Some customers shook their heads in disapproval, convinced of his guilt, without a shred of proof. Others smirked, as if the scene confirmed what they had always believed. The father's heart pounded. It was not the physical restraint that hurt most, it was the humiliation, the sense that decades of labor, sacrifice, and quiet dignity had been erased in a single moment. His life, his struggles, his resilience, none of it mattered. To them, he was nothing more than a suspect, a man defined by the color of his skin. He tried to speak again, to insist on his innocence, but his words were swallowed by prejudice. The security guard tightened his hold, leading him toward the center of the room as though parading his guilt for all to see. The old man's paper bag slipped from his grasp, spilling its contents onto the floor. Coins rolled across the marble, the newspaper fluttered open, and a few documents slid out, their edges curling. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not loud, but sharp enough to pierce. Some shook their heads with feigned pity, others whispered insults barely concealed behind their hands. The father bent slightly, wanting to gather his belongings, but the guard yanked him upright, forbidding even the dignity of reclaiming what he had dropped. His body trembled, not from guilt, but from the weight of shame. Memories surged. The candy. He had never stolen as a boy. The slurs hurled at him in the street. The countless times he had been dismissed before he could prove himself. All of it condensed into this moment, this theater of accusation where he had no voice. And still, no one asked for evidence. No one questioned the missing wallet's owner, who by now was less frantic, more eager to watch the spectacle unfold. The assumption of guilt was enough. The skin he wore was evidence, the lines on his face a verdict, the tremor in his hands mistaken for nervousness rather than age. The father's eyes burned, not with tears but with a sorrow too deep for words. He thought of his son, of the empire. He had built, the heights he had reached, the respect he commanded in boardrooms and governments. Yet here he was, the father of that man, dragged through a bank like a criminal, stripped of dignity before strangers. If only they knew. If only they could see beyond their prejudice, they would understand that the man they mocked was the root of a legacy, the foundation of greatness. But they did not see. They refused to see. The whispers grew louder, the laughter crueler. Some customers stepped back as if his very presence tainted the air. Others leaned forward, eager to watch humiliation unravel. The teller, who had first looked at him with polite dismissal, now folded her arms, her expression smug, as though certain justice was being served. The old man's knees wavered beneath him, but he stood as tall as he could, refusing to collapse under their gaze. His silence spoke louder than any plea. A silence forged by years of endurance, sharpened by scars invisible to those who condemned him. Still, the security guard pressed forward, steering him toward a corner where accusations would soon harden into formal shame. The father's breath came heavy, each step dragging centuries of injustice behind it. And just as the weight threatened to crush him entirely, the atmosphere shifted. The bank's glass doors opened once more, and a new presence entered. A presence that carried authority, wealth, and command in every measured step. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and recognition rippled like a wave through the room. The billionaire son had arrived. The doors closed behind him with a muted thud, and silence fell across the bank as though the very air recognized his presence. The billionaire son carried himself with the ease of one accustomed to power. Broad shoulders squared, stride steady, eyes sharp and assessing. His tailored suit caught the light, every detail immaculate, every step echoing with quiet authority. For many in the room, recognition was immediate. Faces turned pale, whispers shot through the crowd. Here was a man they had only seen on television, a figure spoken about in hushed awe in boardrooms, a symbol of triumph that transcended the boundaries most never dared to cross. His name carried weight like stone, his fortune a fortress of influence, and, yet, the crowd that had laughed moments earlier now fumbled for composure. The teller straightened abruptly, smoothing her uniform as though tidiness could erase her earlier disdain. The security guard's grip slackened, uncertainty clouding his stern expression. Customers who had whispered insults moments before now forced polite smiles, eager to appear innocent of cruelty. But the son's gaze did not waver. He saw his father immediately, held by the arm, coins scattered at his feet, documents strewn across the marble floor like discarded scraps. He saw the slump in his shoulders, the weariness in his stance, the quiet humiliation carved deep into his features. A storm rose within him, sharp and relentless. He had faced competitors who underestimated him, endured boardrooms filled with doubt, and carved his way through barriers meant to keep him out. But nothing pierced him more deeply than seeing the man who had sacrificed everything for him reduced to a spectacle of shame. The son's eyes swept the room, cold and unblinking. The whispers died. No one moved. The weight of his gaze pressed on them heavier than any spoken accusation. Without a word, he bent down, gathering the documents his father had dropped. His hands, so often accustomed to contracts worth millions, now treated each crumpled page with reverence, smoothing them gently before placing them back into the paper bag. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Shame prickled in the air, though no apology had yet been spoken. The son's silence was louder than any outcry. Finally, he turned to the security guard. His voice, when it came, was calm but razor-edged, each word deliberate. Though soft, it carried through the hall with the weight of command. The guard's jaw tightened, his grip on the old man's arm faltering further. He muttered something about a missing wallet, about suspicion, about protocol. His excuses crumbled beneath the son's steady stare. Then the son did what none expected. He stepped closer to his father, laying a hand on his shoulder, not as a gesture of pity but of reverence. It was a declaration, a statement clearer than any spoken defense. The room held its breath, and then, in a voice that carried authority no one dared challenge, he spoke the truth that shattered every assumption in the room. "This man you accuse," he said, his eyes sweeping across the guilty faces, "is not a thief. He is my father." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The teller's face drained of color, the security guard froze, and the man who had lost his wallet stood slack-jawed, his earlier certainty unraveling. Customers shifted uneasily, shame curdling into silence. For the father, the words were both balm and burden. Balm, because his son had claimed him openly, proudly, refusing to let prejudice define him. Burden, because he had never wanted his son's success to be wielded as a shield against cruelty. He had endured humiliation his whole life, believing dignity was found in silence. But now, the silence had been broken, and the truth rang louder than the injustice. The son did not stop there. He straightened, his presence filling the room, and declared what no one could have imagined. He spoke of ownership, of power, of the truth hidden behind his father's simple appearance. This was not merely an old man dragged unfairly through suspicion. This was the father of the very man who now owned the bank itself. Whispers turned to gasps, gasps into stunned silence. The teller's hands shook, the security guard stepped back as though burned, and the customers who had laughed now avoided his gaze. The son's eyes did not soften. He looked at each face, one by one, forcing them to confront their prejudice. He spoke not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable authority of a man whose wealth and power left no room for doubt. Every word carried weight, each syllable striking, like stone against glass. In that moment, the rising action reached its peak. The father, once humiliated, now stood with dignity restored, not because of wealth alone, but because the son had refused to let the world erase the truth of who he was. And yet, the tension had not broken. The shame in the room was heavy, the silence oppressive, but the confrontation had only just begun. For what was at stake was not merely reputation or wealth, but the very question of worth, of humanity, of dignity in a world too quick to judge. The father's head bowed slightly, not in defeat, but in the quiet weight of revelation. His son had raised him before the world, but the scars of humiliation still burned. The bank, the crowd, the whispers. They would linger long after this moment. And so the stage was set for the climax, where anger, shame, and truth would collide in the most devastating confrontation of all. The silence that followed the son's declaration was suffocating. It clung to the walls, to the marble floor, to the very air, heavy and unrelenting. No one moved, no one dared to breathe too loudly, as if the weight of the moment demanded stillness. The son stood tall, his hand resting firmly on his father's trembling shoulder. His voice, calm yet thunderous, lingered in the ears of all who had heard it. "He is my father." Those words cracked the air like lightning. The teller's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her earlier sharpness dissolved into wide-eyed shock, her cheeks flushed crimson. The security guard, once so assured, now shifted uneasily, his hand falling from the old man's arm as though the contact itself had burned him. The customers, who only minutes earlier had exchanged cruel whispers, now turned their eyes to the floor, each silently scrambling for excuses to shield themselves from guilt. The man who had lost his wallet paled, his indignation shriveling into fear. His accusations, once bolstered by the crowd's laughter, now trembled in the face of truth. But the son was not finished. He bent slowly, retrieving the last of the scattered coins from the floor, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. One by one he placed them into his father's calloused hand. It was an act of restoration, a son lifting his father back to dignity, coin by coin. The crowd watched, transfixed, unable to look away. Then, straightening to his full height, he turned his gaze upon the teller. "You looked at him," he said evenly, "and saw a thief. You did not ask, you did not wait, you did not listen. You saw his skin, his age, his clothes, and you judged." His words cut sharper than a blade. The teller's hands fidgeted nervously, papers rustling like whispers in her grasp. Next, he turned to the security guard. "And you, sworn to protect, but eager to condemn. You dragged him as though he were a criminal, though his only crime was daring to walk into this bank with dignity." The guard swallowed hard, his jaw clenching as if to keep shame from escaping in words. The son's gaze then swept across the customers. His voice rose slightly, resonant and commanding, each syllable striking the room like a gavel. "And you, all of you, laughed. You whispered. You joined in his humiliation, eager to believe the worst of him because it was easier than questioning your own prejudice." No one dared to meet his eyes. The room had shifted. No longer was the father, the accused. Now it was the crowd, stripped bare before the truth. The father, standing beside his son, felt torn between pride and pain. Pride, because his son had defended him with a fire that could not be extinguished. Pain, because such defense had been needed at all. He lowered his gaze, his weathered hands trembling slightly. The sting of humiliation still raw despite the reversal. The son, sensing the weight of his father's silence, softened his tone. He turned to him, his voice now thick with emotion. "You should never have been made to endure this. Not here, not anywhere." The father's eyes glistened, though he said nothing. Words had never been his way. He had carried a lifetime of indignities in silence, but this moment, this fierce declaration, left him struggling against tears he could no longer hide. The crowd saw it too, and guilt deepened. What had been a scene of mockery was now transformed into a mirror, forcing them to see their cruelty reflected back at them. But the son was not content with silence. He knew prejudice did not dissolve with a single revelation. It had to be shattered, piece by piece, until nothing remained. And so, with deliberate calm, he added the words that would ignite the storm fully. "You stand in judgment of him," he said, voice echoing, "without knowing the truth. But the truth is this: the man you mocked, the man you accused, the man you sought to disgrace, is not just my father. He is the reason this bank stands at all." Gasps rippled through the room. Confusion flickered across faces. Questions darted silently between eyes. The teller blinked rapidly, her lips forming half words she dared not speak. The father closed his eyes, his chest tightening. He had never wanted his son's wealth wielded like a weapon, but the tide had already turned. The revelation had begun, and there would be no stopping it now. The son's words hung in the air, heavy, unrelenting, undeniable. The moment was no longer one of humiliation. It had become the first strike in a reckoning. And still, this was only the beginning. The room still trembled under the son's words, when hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor. The glass doors to the inner offices swung open, and the bank manager emerged, summoned by the whispers that had rushed through the staff like wildfire. He was a man dressed in sharp grey, his tie knotted tightly, his expression taut with irritation. He strode forward briskly, unaware of the storm he was about to step into. His eyes darted first to the security guard, then to the teller, then to the old man still clutching his paper bag, his brows furrowed in disapproval. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice clipped, practiced in authority. "Why is there disruption in my branch?" The teller stammered, her earlier certainty now crumbling. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding. This man," she pointed toward the father, her finger trembling, "was accused of trying to take a wallet." The guard intervened. "We were only—" But the manager cut her off with a sharp gesture. His gaze settled on the father with cold efficiency, the way a man might assess an object rather than a person. His lips pressed into a thin line, suspicion clear in his eyes. "Is this true?" he asked the guard, though his tone already carried judgment. The guard hesitated, his confidence shaken by the son's earlier words. "There was an accusation, sir. A customer claimed his wallet was missing and, well, the situation escalated." The manager exhaled heavily, as though the matter were beneath him, but still demanded his time. He turned to the father with barely veiled disdain. "Sir, do you realize the seriousness of theft? This bank cannot tolerate such disturbances. If you were found to have—" "Stop!" The single word from the son sliced through the air like a blade. The manager turned sharply, his irritation morphing into recognition as his eyes fell upon the imposing figure in the immaculate suit. For a heartbeat, his expression flickered with confusion, then disbelief, and finally, unease. He had seen the man's face before, on screens, in financial reports, in news articles that spoke of empires built from nothing. His voice faltered. You're... "Yes," the son said, his tone icy, cutting short any attempt at flattery. "And this is my father." The manager's composure cracked, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. He glanced at the teller, at the guard, at the gawking customers, as if searching for escape. "Sir, I assure you this was not intentional. A simple misunderstanding. The staff, perhaps they acted hastily, but no harm was meant." "No harm?" The son's voice rose, still controlled but weighted with fury. "You call dragging an old man across the floor no harm? You call public humiliation no harm? You call judgment without evidence no harm?" The manager flinched beneath the words, his authority dissolving under the force of truth. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. "Please, lower your voice," he muttered, glancing at the other customers. "We don't want a scene." The son took a step forward, his presence towering. "The scene has already been made. Not by me, but by your staff, your guard, your customers. Every one of them so eager to believe a man guilty simply because of how he looked." The manager tried to recover, his voice slick with appeasement. "I assure you our bank does not tolerate discrimination. If a mistake was made, we will issue an apology." "An apology?" The son's laugh was short, bitter. "You think words will undo what was done? You think a polite excuse erases the sting of suspicion that has followed my father all his life?" The father shifted beside him, his eyes cast downward. He wished, in that moment, to retreat into silence, to end the confrontation before it spiraled further. But the son's grip on his shoulder was firm, steady, refusing retreat. The manager's lips twitched into a nervous smile. "Sir, please, Allow us to handle this privately. I assure you, no. The refusal was final, thunderous. The son's voice filled every corner of the hall. There will be no silence this time. No backroom apologies, no quiet erasures. Every person here will hear the truth. The crowd stirred, unease rippling through them. The teller wrung her hands. The guard shifted from foot to foot. Customers exchanged nervous glances. The weight of reckoning pressed down on all of them. The son let the silence stretch, commanding every eye, every ear. And then, with deliberate clarity, he spoke the words that shattered the fragile facade of the room. This bank that you call yours belongs to me. The declaration thundered through the hall. Gasps erupted, disbelief breaking across faces like waves. The manager's jaw dropped, his composure utterly shattered. Yours? He stammered, his voice trembling. Yes, the son said, his gaze unflinching. I own it. Every wall, every desk, every coin in its vaults. And the man you dared to shame, this man you accused, dragged, mocked, is the father of the one who signs your paychecks. The teller nearly collapsed against her counter, her face drained of all color. The guard looked as though the floor might swallow him whole. Customers shifted uncomfortably, shame scorching their cheeks. The man who had lost his wallet muttered incoherently, his arrogance stripped to nothing. The father stood frozen, overwhelmed by the revelation. Though he had known his son's power, he had never seen it wielded so openly, so fiercely on his behalf. A strange mix of pride and sorrow washed over him. Pride that his son had risen so high, sorrow that prejudice had forced such a declaration. The manager tried to recover, stammering, "Sir, I didn't realize. Had I known—" "That's the problem," the son cut in sharply. "You shouldn't have to know. You shouldn't need wealth or titles to treat a man with dignity. His worth is not measured by my fortune, nor by the name you recognized only moments ago. His worth has always been there. You simply chose not to see it." The words struck harder than any blow. The crowd lowered their eyes, unable to meet the son's piercing gaze. Shame hung thick in the air, undeniable, inescapable. And in the midst of it all, the father closed his eyes, his chest heavy with emotion. He had carried silence all his life, but in this moment, his son's voice had become the roar he himself had never spoken. The bank no longer felt like marble and glass. It felt like a courtroom, and every guilty soul had been put on trial, yet the storm had not yet broken fully. For there was still the father's voice, trembling but present, waiting to rise at last. And when it did, the reckoning would reach its true peak. The son's words still echoed, reverberating through the vaulted ceiling and into the marrow of every soul in the room. This bank belongs to me, and the man you disgraced is my father. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. The teller's fingers gripped the edge of her counter until her knuckles blanched white. The guard's eyes darted everywhere but at the old man he had manhandled. The manager stood stiff, sweat forming along his brow despite the chill of the air-conditioned hall. And the customers, those who had laughed, whispered, accused, now shifted in uneasy silence, their shame a palpable fog. But amid the stunned quiet, the father trembled. His calloused hands clutched the paper bag close to his chest, as though it might shield him from the suffocating attention now fixed upon him. His heart thudded against his ribs, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of being seen, not as invisible, not as ordinary, but as the centerpiece of a reckoning. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to his son. In them lay a storm of emotion, gratitude, pride, but also sorrow. He had never wanted his boy to wield his wealth like a weapon. He had never asked for vengeance, only dignity. And yet, here they were, in the heart of a spectacle he could neither escape nor silence. The son met his gaze, and for a fleeting moment the power in his stance softened. Beneath the armor of authority, he was still a son looking at the man who had once walked miles in worn shoes, so he might one day stand tall. The father's lips parted, his voice low, gravelly with age and emotion. "My boy." His words faltered, barely carrying beyond the first few rows of the crowd. But the room, straining for sound, caught every syllable. "You didn't have to do this. I've lived this way all my life. I know what people see when they look at me." The son shook his head, his tone fierce. "You shouldn't have to accept it. Not now, not ever." The father's gaze dropped to the floor, his voice weighted with quiet pain. "I am old. I have carried this burden for decades. I learned to swallow the shame because there was no other choice. But you—" He paused, his throat tight. "You were my choice, my sacrifice, my hope. I wanted you to rise above it, not be dragged back into it because of me." A murmur stirred in the crowd, soft, uneasy, like the shifting of guilt through many hearts. But the son would not let the words stand as surrender. He straightened, his voice rising, sharp and commanding, each word aimed at every guilty face. "No, you endured because you had to. You bent beneath the weight of injustice so that I might stand tall. But I will not let the world bend you anymore. Not while I still draw breath." His voice thundered across the hall, unshakable, unyielding. The weight of generations, of silent suffering, poured through every syllable. "You call him a thief. You call him less. But you don't see what he gave. He is the reason I exist. He is the reason this empire exists. He is the foundation upon which your jobs, your salaries, your comforts rest. Without him, none of this, none of me, would be here." The words struck like fire, igniting the silence into raw truth. Faces crumpled with shame. The teller bit her lip, tears brimming in her eyes. The guard swallowed hard, his chest heaving with regret he dared not voice. Even the arrogant man, who had lost his wallet, now shrank into the corner, stripped of every shred of certainty. The father, standing in the center of it all, felt his knees weaken. He had spent a lifetime unseen, judged, discarded. To hear his son lay his worth bare, before the world was a salve so sharp it almost hurt. His chest heaved, his eyes glistening, his lips trembling as though torn between silence and the scream of decades. And then, in a voice steadier than he thought he still possessed, he spoke, not to his son, but to the room. "You looked at me and saw nothing," he said quietly. His voice cracked, but it carried. "You saw an old man in worn shoes, a face you did not trust, a body you thought too small to matter. You saw what you wanted to see, but you did not see the nights I walked home hungry so my boy could eat. You did not see the calluses that built his tomorrow. You did not see the blood and sweat that laid the stones for the life he stands in now." The room was silent, every heart clutched by the gravity of his words. "I do not need riches to prove my worth," he continued, his voice trembling but resolute. "I am enough. I was always enough. But you chose not to see it." A tear slipped down his cheek, and still he stood tall, weathered but unbroken. The son's chest swelled with emotion, pride and fury interwoven. He looked at the crowd, his voice now quiet, but cutting deeper than thunder. You shamed the wrong man today, and though you tried to strip him of dignity, all you've done is expose your own. The words lingered, heavy, final. No one spoke, no one dared. The tellers. Tears fell silently onto her desk. The guard lowered his head in shame. The manager, once proud and rigid, now stood hollow, his authority stripped bare. The bank, once a stage of humiliation, had become a tribunal of truth. And in the center of it stood not a thief, not a suspect, but a father. A man whose quiet sacrifice had built an empire, whose worth could no longer be denied. And in that silence, the reckoning was complete. The silence in the bank stretched long after the father's trembling words fell into it. For once, it was not the silence of suspicion or disregard, but of reckoning. The old man, who had been dragged through humiliation only minutes earlier, now stood at the center of a truth that no one could look away from. His son remained at his side, hand firm on his shoulder, a sentinel against any further indignity. The sharp lines of his face softened slightly, but his eyes still blazed with the fire of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty to ever allow it unchecked. The crowd, chastened and subdued, shifted uneasily, weighed down by shame. The bank manager, pale and trembling, finally found the strength to speak. His voice, once clipped and commanding, now quivered like dry paper. Sir, please, we never meant— But the words died in his throat. He knew, as did everyone in that room, that excuses were meaningless. Nothing could erase the sight of an old man dragged across marble floors, coins spilled like crumbs of dignity, whispers cutting sharper than knives. The father, however, did not look at the manager. He did not look at the teller or the guard, or the customers who avoided his gaze. He looked only at his son. And in that gaze was everything: pride, sorrow, gratitude, and the silent plea of a man who had lived too long in shadows and did not wish for his boy to carry them forward. Gently he patted his son's hand, still resting on his shoulder. "That is enough," he murmured, his voice ragged but resolute. "We have said what needed to be said." But his son's jaw tightened. "It will never be enough, not while men like you suffer silently and others pretend not to see. They need to hear it. They need to remember it." The father sighed, weary yet dignified. "Then let them remember not my shame, but my strength. Let them remember that I endured." The words pierced deeper than any rebuke. The room, already heavy with guilt, now bowed beneath the weight of truth spoken without anger, without vengeance, just raw humanity. The son took a deep breath, letting the fire in him simmer into steel. He turned once more to the assembled faces. "You heard him. He endured. And men like him endure every day. You walk past them on sidewalks. You serve them last in lines. You look at them and see less than yourselves. And yet, it is on their shoulders that men like me rise. Never forget that." No one dared to respond. Heads lowered further, shame choking the air. The father and son walked together to the exit, their steps slow but certain. The old man's hand clutched his paper bag, no longer a symbol of fragility, but of resilience. The doors opened, sunlight spilling in to greet them. For the father, it felt like stepping out of a cage of judgment into the open air of dignity restored. Outside, the city bustled as though nothing had happened. Cars roared past, Strangers hurried about their errands, the world indifferent to the storm that had just passed within the bank's glass walls. Yet something had shifted. For those inside, indifference was no longer possible. They had been forced to confront themselves, and the image in that mirror was not easily forgotten. In the days that followed, the story spread, first in hushed whispers, then in louder voices, until it rippled through neighborhoods and offices alike. Some recounted it with embarrassment, others with awe, but all who told it carried the same refrain. The old man was no thief. He was the father of the bank's owner, and he had endured a lifetime of injustice in silence until his son shattered that silence for him. The teller resigned within weeks, unable to shake the image of the man she had dismissed so quickly. The security guard, once proud of his authority, now carried the memory like a weight he could not lay down. The bank manager, stripped of his composure, learned humility in the hardest way, his arrogance broken in a single afternoon. But for the father, life returned to its quiet rhythm. He still woke at dawn, watered his plants, greeted neighbors with a nod. He still wore his old shoes, still carried his groceries in worn bags, still drank coffee from the chipped mug he had owned. For decades, on the surface, nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. When he walked down the street now, people looked at him differently. Not all with understanding, but with hesitation, with caution, with a flicker of respect that had not been there before. For some, it was respect born of guilt. For others, it was respect born of fear. But for a few, just a few, it was respect born of recognition. Recognition that behind his weathered frame stood decades of sacrifice and strength. The quiet power of a man who had carried burdens greater than most could imagine. The son visited more often after that day. He sat at the same wooden table, his suit jacket draped across the back of the chair, his empire momentarily set aside. And together they talked, not of wealth or power, but of life, of memories, of the years that had shaped them both. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, the father spoke softly. "You gave me a gift that day," he said. "You gave me a voice I never thought I'd have." The son shook his head. "No, father. That voice was always yours. The world just never listened. I only made them hear." The father smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with pride. "Then let them hear, my boy. Let them hear not just for me, but for every man and woman still silenced by the weight of prejudice. Let them hear until silence is no longer needed." The son nodded, his resolve etched deep. He knew the fight was not over. It was bigger than one bank, one room, one humiliation. It was the story of countless lives dismissed, diminished, erased. And though he could not undo the past, he could honor it, with truth, with justice, with a love that refused to bow. And so, the story lived on, not as a tale of wealth or power, but as a reminder. A reminder that dignity does not come from riches, but from endurance. A reminder that love, fierce and unyielding, can shatter even the strongest chains of prejudice. A reminder that silence, though endured for a lifetime, can be broken in a single, thunderous moment. As the father drifted into sleep that night, the weight of decades heavy upon him, he whispered a quiet prayer, not for vengeance, not for riches, but for a world where no one would need to endure what he had. And the son, watching him, whispered his own vow. "One day, father, one day it will be so."